Calvin Presley was 63 years old, the spring he watched a 14-year-old boy paint peach trees white, and he said later that he didn't understand what he was seeing until the harvest came in. Calvin had been growing peaches in Saluda County, South Carolina for 31 years. He thought he knew most of what there was to know about the ground on that particular stretch of road. He did not know what James Mobley knew. Nobody over there did, except James's grandfather, and James's grandfather had been dead for 7 months. The grandfather's name was Ezra Mobley. He had farmed 14 acres on the old Prosperity Road since 1952, the same 14 acres his own father had sharecropped before the family saved enough to buy them outright in 1948. Ezra grew peaches. He grew some vegetables for the house and a few rows of butter beans he sold at the roadside stand his wife Nettie ran on Saturdays. But peaches were the crop. Alberta and Loring, and a few rows of O'Henry along the creek side. He had put every one of those trees in himself, one hole at a time, with a spade and a tamping bar in the spring of 1953. He was 31 years old. He expected to work that orchard for the rest of his life. That is what he did. Somebody had to write this one down before it was forgotten. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a second to subscribe before we go any further. The rest of it matters. What Ezra knew about peach trees he had learned from a man named Silas Washington, who had farmed the river bottom ground down near Batesburg until the mid-1940s, when his health gave out and he moved in with his daughter. Silas was not a man who had ever been inside an extension office. He was not a man the extension office had ever asked about much of anything. He had grown stone fruit on Edgefield County ground for 40 years, through the drought of 1930 and the flood year of 1936 and the bad freezes of 1940 and 1943. And he had learned what he'd learned the way men learned things in those years, by watching, and by losing, and by watching some more after the losing was done. The things Silas had told Ezra, in 1949, when Ezra was working a neighbor's orchard to earn money while his father's purchase went through, was this: the south face of the trunk will fool itself in a warm January. It will think the season has changed. And then the cold comes back and it finds out it was wrong, and it cracks, and once it cracks the borers find it, and once the borers find it you have lost that tree for 3 or 4 years at least. You paint the trunk white, the south face stays cool even in the warm spells, the tree stays dormant, the tree stays whole. Silas said he had learned it from an older man, a man who had worked orchards in Augusta County, Virginia before the Depression moved him south, and that man had learned it from someone before him. And Silas did not know where the chain started and didn't think it mattered. Ezra asked him how far up the trunk. Silas said knee height. Said some men went higher, but knee height was where the damage happened, and knee height was enough. Ezra never forgot it. When he planted his own orchard in 1953, he painted every trunk that first November before the frost window opened. And he painted them every November after that for 33 years, until the November he was too sick to do it himself, and James, who was 7 years old, helped him finish the last 2 rows. James remembered that morning. He remembered Ezra handing him the brush and showing him how to start at the soil line and work upward in long strokes so the paint didn't sag. He remembered the smell of the flat white latex in the cold air. He remembered Ezra telling him that the tree couldn't see what was coming, that the paint was how you told it to wait, to hold still, that the season wasn't ready yet. James had not fully understood that at 7. He understood it better by the time he was 14. Ezra died in October of 1986. James's mother, Loretta, was not a farmer. She had a job at the mill in Leesville, and she was not going to give it up. She told James the orchard was his if he wanted to try to keep it going, and she told him she didn't expect him to manage it alone at 14, and she told him that whatever he decided was all right with her. James decided to try. Calvin Presley watched him from across the fence that first November. Calvin had the property to the east, 30 acres of Red Haven and Reliance, and he had known Ezra Mobley in the way that neighboring farmers know each other, by proximity and occasional conversation, by the silent accounting that happens when a man can see another man's trees from his own rows. Ezra had been good with his trees. Calvin had respected that without ever saying so directly. What Calvin watched that November morning was a thin 14-year-old boy moving through the rows of Alberta trees with a 4-inch brush and a bucket, painting the lower trunks white in the same methodical way he had seen Ezra do it for years. He had never asked Ezra what the painting was for. He had assumed it was something, insect deterrent, maybe, or something to do with the bark. And then he had stopped wondering about it, because his own trees were doing fine, and he had not felt the need to change anything. The county extension agent came by in the spring of James's first year. His name was Dorset, and he was a young man, newer to the county, and he walked the orchard rows with a clipboard the way young agents did, taking notes on spacing and spray programs and soil condition. He stopped at one of the painted trunks and looked at it for a moment. He asked James what the white paint was. James told him it kept the bark from cracking in the winter. Dorset said he hadn't seen that recommended for this area. James said his grandfather had done it every year since 1953. Dorset made a note on his clipboard. He said that folk practices sometimes had a basis in fact and sometimes didn't, and that James was welcome to continue if he wanted, but that there was no data he was aware of that supported painting trunks in this particular way for this particular purpose, and that James might want to think about whether his time was being well spent. James said he'd think about it. He kept painting every November. He was not going to stop doing something Ezra had done for 33 years because a man with a clipboard had not heard of it. The February of James's second year brought a warm stretch that ran 6 days in a row, temperatures in the upper 50s, enough to push the bloom buds on the early trees toward pink tip. Then the front came through on a Thursday night, and the temperature dropped to 21 degrees by Friday morning. James was up before dawn, walking the rows in the cold with a flashlight, looking at bark. His trees held. 14 acres of Alberta and Loring and O'Henry, the trunks pale white in the flashlight beam, and almost no south face, cracking anywhere. 2 trees in the creekside block had minor damage, young trees he'd planted himself the previous spring, not yet old enough to have been painted before the freeze window opened. Calvin Presley lost 11 trees outright that February and had south-face bark damage on 40% of his surviving Red Haven block. He spent the spring treating borer entry points and cutting out deadwood. His yield that season was down by 1/3. He did not immediately connect his losses to James's painting. It took him until midsummer, when he walked his own rows and walked James's rows on the same afternoon, and stood for a long time looking at the difference in bark condition between the 2 orchards. The difference was not subtle. His trees showed the stress lines of the February freeze in their bark, in their canopy density, in the way the new growth was coming in, irregular and tentative. James's trees looked the way trees look when nothing bad has happened to them. Calvin walked to the fence line. James was working the irrigation at the far end of the O'Henry block. Calvin waited. When James came back down the row, Calvin asked him straight, "Is it the paint?" James said yes. Calvin asked him how it worked. James told him. South face of the trunk heats up in a warm January afternoon. Thinks the season has changed. Cold comes back and finds it wrong. Cracks. You paint it white. It stays cool, stays dormant, stays whole. Knee height is where the damage happens. Calvin was quiet for a moment. He was 64 years old. He had been growing peaches in that county for 32 years. He said, "Your grandfather knew this." James said his grandfather had learned it from a man named Silas Washington, who had farmed the river bottom ground down near Batesburg. And Silas had learned it from a man who came down from Augusta County, Virginia, and James did not know who that man had learned it from. Calvin said he'd wished he had asked Ezra about it while he had the chance. James said a lot of people had probably wished that about a lot of things Ezra knew. That fall, Calvin painted his trunks. He came over to James's fence line in October and asked him what he was using, and James told him, flat white latex. Same brand Ezra had always bought at the hardware store in Saluda. The cheapest version they carried, because Ezra had tried the more expensive kind once and found no difference. Calvin bought 4 gallons. He did his entire Red Haven block. The following February, when the county took another warm stretch followed by a hard freeze, Calvin's trees held. He told 2 other growers in the county. They thought he was describing a superstition. He showed them his bark. He showed them James's bark. One of them started painting the following November. Dorset, the extension agent with the clipboard, left Saluda County in 1990 for a position closer to Columbia. His successor, a woman named Tab, came through James's orchard in the spring of 1991 and spent a long time looking at the trunks. She asked James about it in a different way than Dorset had, not as a challenge, but as a question. He told her what he'd told Calvin. She took notes. She told him she'd seen it referenced in some older extension literature from Virginia and North Carolina and hadn't thought anyone in South Carolina was still doing it. James said he wouldn't know about the literature. He said his grandfather had done it. Tab asked if she could photograph the trunks. James said yes. He did not know what she did with the photographs. He never heard from her about it again, and the county extension recommendations for the area did not change as far as he knew. He kept painting regardless. Ezra Mobley's 14 acres in Saluda County are 22 acres now. James bought the adjacent parcel in 1997 when the family that owned it moved to Greenville. He has a man named Porter who helps him with the heavy work and a girl from Batesburg who comes in at harvest. His trees are healthy in the way that trees are healthy when they have been looked after for a long time. Not dramatically, not in a way that calls attention to itself. Just steady. Every November, before the frost window opens, he buys flat white latex at the hardware store in Saluda. He still uses the 4-inch brush, though the handle on the one Ezra gave him finally split about 10 years ago and he had to replace it. The brush is different. Everything else is the same. Calvin Presley died in 2011. He is buried in the Baptist Church Cemetery on Highway 39. His son Robert runs the peach operation now, and Robert paints his trunks every November without being reminded, because he grew up watching his father do it, and his father told him why, and his father told him where it came from. Ezra Mobley. That's where it came from, as far as Robert Presley knows. Which is true, as far as it goes. The chain goes back further than that. Through Silas Washington and the unnamed man from Augusta County, and whoever came before him. Back through people who watched their trees crack in February and asked why, and paid attention to the answer long enough to pass it to someone else. The names at the beginning of that chain are not recorded anywhere. That is often how it goes with the knowledge that survives the longest. It travels without a label, from hand to hand, and by the time it reaches you, you may not know to wonder where it started. James Mobley knows to wonder. He learned that from Ezra, too.